it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink and listen. Well, they say that all cities are mad, but the madness is gallant, and that all cities are beautiful, but the beauty is grim. Such is the case in tonight's story of the city that knows no peace. The city that I live in is old, not just by the date of settlement, even before the Spanish conquest, but from the time that the first men sealed the earth with the blood of the other tribes. The Huachichil tribe were sanguinary people, loathing the sight of newcomers, so by the time the Spanish came to this territory, bloodshed was on their mind. The fight was bloody during the day, the desperate screams of native women and children shot and pierced by the Spanish swords, mutilated soldiers moaning on their deathbed. During the night, the war drums, chants, dancing and the wailing of the morning were the only sounds to be heard. As history books now tell us, they were finally conquered with disease, oozing welts and delirious fevers, somehow healed by salvation of the Lord and God of the Christians, and some mysterious white powders under the care of priests brought over the sea to care for the sick. The Huachichil were cunning people who would not give up easily. The shamans of the tribe gathered and are said to have cursed those who at that time, and those who would walk this land in the future, to be rich but miserable, never at peace. If you walk the downtown streets today, and you can feel the spirits of the past, the anger and the sadness that seems to follow each of the inhabitants of the city, who go about with their heads bent down in the absence of a smile. Children are sullen. The young and adults are only gregarious when drunk, a pastime all too common in this city, and the old spend their days at church with their thumb and index finger indented with the shape of rosary beads, praying for the eternal rest they all seem so desperate for. As much as Town Hall tries its best to renovate the dilapidated historical buildings, in a matter of months they fall into disrepair again, paint peeling, pieces of walls tumbling to the ground as people walk by, sidestepping the stone, not even bothering to glance up to see where it had fallen from. The air as heavy as the hearts of the people who live here. As a child, my family and I would visit this city, back when it was still a town, during summer vacation. I remember being about 8 years old enough to walk to the nearest corner store by myself, but too young to be out alone at night. My grandmother, aunts and uncles will tell me that the cuco, a man who stole children away to an unknown destiny, would take me and I would never see them again. A horrifying idea for such a young child. So I was very respectful of the curfew. As soon as the sun started to set, I made my way back to my grandmother's house. One late afternoon, I'd overstayed a visit to an elder neighbour's house a few blocks away. A lady who told me stories of her own childhood at the family farm, which I found fascinating, being a city dweller, and this was new to me. She started to doze off in the middle of a story, so I decided to tiptoe out of the house, closing the door behind me. As I turned to step off the porch, I was confronted by a dark sky and a silent street. I panicked, not knowing what I feared more, the cuco or the anger of my family. Regardless, I had to get home. Stepping onto the sidewalk, I saw that the 2 blocks that I had to walk were dark. Streetlights were off for some reason. A few old crumbling houses on the way looked even darker. A tunnel of darkness. A tunnel I had to walk through to get to the streetlight that marked the corner I had to turn to get to my grandmother's. Once there, I'd be safe. I mustered all the courage a little child could. I clenched my hands into fists and started to walk at a fast pace. The first block was silent. No people, no cars, no dogs or night sounds. I got to the corner, stopped and ran across the street. I continued quickly, knowing I was almost there. Suddenly, to my right, from between the panels of a broken door, I felt a gust of icy cold wind. I stopped and turned to see where it had come from. It was the middle of summer. The air had been hot and sticky. There, within the frame of the broken door, stood a man. Beyond him, I saw the house had no roof. I looked back at him. He smiled a crooked smile. Black and yellow uneven teeth were revealed. "Hello, my name is Don Quintero. What is your name?" he said. I snapped out of my trance and ran the rest of the way to my grandmother's house, slamming the door behind me, startling my parents and the rest of the family who'd gathered in the dining room. Needless to say, I was grounded for the rest of the week. I burst into tears and ran into the guest room. A few minutes later, my grandmother came into the room with a dinner plate and asked me what had happened. I told her, and she started to lose colour. She became very pale. Worry started to settle in her eyes. She told me she would speak to my parents. Everything would be fine tomorrow, and I would be able to go out with my cousins. She kissed my forehead and left me to eat my now cold food. I stopped halfway. I noticed that the laughing and chatting of the adults had died down to whispers. I silently walked to the corner of the dining room, out of their sight, and listened. My grandmother spoke of a time during the Revolution when the men would hide their wives and children in the cellars and basements for fear of them being raped or taken away to be used as practice targets by the rebel soldiers that passed through the town on their way to the camps. Money and valuables were buried in the floors or sealed in the walls of the homes for safekeeping. She was a child herself during this time and had experienced being locked in the cellar. Fear was part of everyday life. The men in the neighborhood and surrounding blocks gathered in the afternoons to discuss what could be done, exchanging suggestions and alerting each other when food was available at the stores. They would go in teams and bring enough for everyone's families. In desperate times, friends and acquaintances were there for each other. But there was one man, always taking more than his fair share. If a whole family was killed, he would look for and steal their money and valuables, taking them home never to be seen again. Well, the men started to shun him, fearful of his greed. Once a talkative man, now he could be heard in his home pacing back and forth behind his wood-panelled door. As fate would have it, by the end of the Revolution, he'd been killed, his body left to rot. No friends or family to claim him, no one to give him a Christian burial, no knowledge of where his money was. His name was Luis Quintero del Rio. Yes, Don Quintero died rich, but miserable. "May God have mercy on his soul," she said, crossing herself. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I started to shake. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I vomited, loudly enough to bring my mother to my side. My grandmother was horrified and asked me how long I'd been standing there. I told her the truth. She picked me up, took me to bed, yelled out for someone to bring a fresh egg, and started to make passes over me with the egg, mumbling words I barely understood. My mother stood there wide-eyed. She'd heard of the ritual of curing the evil eye, but could not understand what it had to do with me. Stomach flu, or maybe the cold food, but anything but this ridiculous evil eye nonsense. My grandmother finished and asked for a glass half filled with water. She broke the egg into it, and the yolk came out blood red, with 2 white spots. The eyes, my grandmother said. I was given some tea and started to feel sleepy. My mother in a chair next to my bed, my grandmother in a rocking chair humming a lullaby. They thought I'd fallen asleep. My mother asked her what had happened. My grandmother continued the story that I had interrupted. Don Quintero's house stood abandoned for several decades, standing the passage of time pretty well, until in the 1930s, 3 young ladies, the youngest barely 15 years old, moved into it. They had lost their parents to an accident and had to sell the family home to pay debts and make ends meet. The town had kindly allowed them to stay in the abandoned house until they could make a stable life for themselves. The house was dirty and dusty, curtains in tatters, some broken furniture that needed to be repaired. So the sisters agreed that, while the 2 older ones went out daily to do odd jobs, the youngest could stay behind and try to make a home out of the house. first few nights, noises could be heard coming from the living room. Slow steps as if someone was dragging their feet, or a chair would be found out of its place. The sisters thought it was because it was an old house, much of it made of wood, and these noises were part of it cooling down in the night air. By the following week, the noises could be heard during the day. The young girl would run out to the front door and stay there until the older sisters came back at sundown. Soon the older sisters noticed that the young one was developing dark circles under her eyes. Her smile was gone, her head bent, she was rapidly losing weight. She insisted everything was well, not wanting to worry her sisters until it became too much to bear. She confessed that she'd been hearing the voice of a man that said, "Don Quintero is here. Don Quintero has to leave." But the house was empty. The sisters, fearful of being involved in unholy gossip, decided that when the young one heard the man, she should call out to him and ask, "What do you want? Do you need prayers? How can we help you?" When the moment came, she crossed herself several times, prayed to the Lord in heaven, and asked the questions, held her breath, and waited. The voice answered, 3 tiles to the north of where the wing-backed chair stands, 1 meter into the entrails of the earth, you will find 3 wooden chests. Use all the contents, use each and every cent, so I may find peace." And then she fainted. By sundown, the older ones came home to find their sister on the floor, and the chair moved to a different place. Smelling salts were found, and the young girl awoke. She told her sisters what the man's voice had told her, and they began to search. They dug all night, until the top of the 3 chests could be seen. Once opened, they revealed coins, jewelry, and other trinkets made of pure gold. The sisters embraced each other, shedding tears of joy. No more worries, no more working for others. They would have comfortable lives. The house was purchased from the town and repaired. With a new business set up and some money in the bank, life had changed for them. But it was short-lived. Once the need for spending the contents of the chest was done, one had been left untouched, placed back in the hole in the floor, covered with dirt, and the floor tiles replaced, left there for safekeeping. Time went by, and the voice was heard again. "Don Quintero is here. Don Quintero has to leave. You have not spent the last cent. I do not have peace." His voice followed them day and night, torturing them. "They confided in me," my grandmother said. "I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had inherited the family home, this house, and remember the name from my childhood. Our neighbor from around the corner. The name of the man that had been shunned for his greed. I told them to seek for a priest, to have the house blessed, to bring in an exorcist, but they did nothing, not wanting to be the talk of the town. Within the month, they were found by a neighbor, dead in their beds, their wrists slit, an empty bottle of pills and a bottle of wine on their nightstands. They had been rich, but miserable. But don't worry, my grandmother told my mother. The child is fine. I'll call upon the angels to look over her. Silence fell between my mother and my grandmother. They both went off to bed. I lay there, thinking of the ghost of a man that called out to me. "Hello, my name is Don Quintero. What is your name?" Not even in death had he found peace. The last cent had not been spent, and he was still looking for someone to do so. Sleep started to overcome me, and then the dreams began. Stories of a city that knows no peace. A rich city. A city of misery. Part 2. That night my dreams were confusing. Children, a school, a cemetery, jumping off a bridge, and many more images that by morning I could not place. It didn't matter. It had happened yesterday, and that morning I would have a day of fun and running about with my cousins. At breakfast, my grandmother placed a necklace around me, a ceramic eye in a brown seed with a black band around it. Ojo de venado. A deer's eye protection, my grandmother told us, and my mother rolled her eyes but said nothing. My cousins came promptly at 9 a.m., all 12 of them, and with my grandmother's blessing we made our way to the nearest park. "Come back by lunchtime and stay away from the castle," were the last words we heard from her as we ran off like rabbits being chased by a fox. The park was a paradise. Green grass, patches of dirt to carve out streets for the miniature cars. Others played with marbles, and later on we played tag. Tired, we lounged on the concrete benches. After a while, a couple of the boys wanted to play soccer, but most of us weren't interested, so they sat sulking on a bench until I heard laughter. I turned to my oldest cousin, Gregorio, and told him to go and ask if they wanted to play. He stood up and surveyed the park. No one to be seen. I insisted and pointed to where I heard the laughter coming from. We all followed him and ended up in front of the castle. He had a look of worry in his eyes. My youngest cousin Sarah, barely 5 years of age, piped up, "Yes, they're in there. I can hear them." From the sidewalk you couldn't see inside. Years of dust and humidity had darkened the windows. Juan, the bravest among us, started to walk up to a window, and suddenly Sarah started to cry. Mary turned to her and asked what was wrong. She pointed to her right and said, "That man's looking at us. He's scary." Gregorio turned to where she'd pointed and saw nothing. He grabbed her and another one of the younger boys, called out to us to follow him, and we ran back to grandmother's, luckily just in time for lunch. We were quiet. One of my uncles asked what was wrong. We weren't a silent group, and he knew something was amiss. No one spoke. No one lifted their heads. We all just stared at our plates and continued to eat. My grandmother stood by the kitchen door. She looked at me as I sunk deeper into my chair. She knew where we'd been. That night I remember changing into a new pajama, a gift from my favorite aunt. I stood in front of a full-length mirror admiring the ribbons and pink kitten images printed on it. I stared at my reflection. The seed that hung around my neck had burst, from the inside out, a sharp edge sticking out from it. I removed it, placing it in a drawer, and hid the chain with the ceramic eye under my shirt, crawled into bed and lay there thinking about the man that Sarah had called out to. I'd seen him too. Again I heard my grandmother talking to my mother. "You need to leave," she told my mother. "They've gone to the castle. That child's susceptible. She sees things and it'll harm her." My mother, wanting to distract my grandmother from such ideas, asked about the castle, and my grandmother told her the story. The castle was the first children's party hall in town. White brick walls with gold trim, towers so high that they overlooked the town. Inside were paintings of animals holding onto colourful balloons, all sorts of slides and jungle gyms for the children to climb. Televisions hung on the walls where cartoons were to be displayed. It was shut down a year after opening, witnessing a tragedy that would shake the town to its core. A politician had held a birthday party for his 12-year-old son. The catering and cake service had been called in from a city close by. Local caterers were old-fashioned, too traditional, and nothing was good enough for his son. The day came, a beautiful spring morning. Guests had started to arrive, children giggling in anticipation, dragging oversized birthday gifts behind them, excited to see their friends, proud mothers holding their heads up high as they walked into the venue. Clowns and cartoon characters, balloons and party favors, music and games filled the hall, laughter and chatter. Oh, it was the place to be. Lunchtime came around and the children were marveled by the colorful meal. Sandwiches, finger food, caramel-covered popcorn, sweets and treats that they'd never seen before. Mothers were served chicken cordon bleu, asparagus salad, tiramisu and coffee. The cake was brought out, a towering replica of a sports car, covered in white frosting with flames ablaze on the sides, tires made of black tinted fondant, every detail you'd expect of a real car. The children tore into the cake, gorging themselves with the sweetness, licking their fingers, cleaning their hands on their clothes. Mother smiled. How privileged their children had been to be invited to this party. Then, the paralysis set in. The children started to slump in their chairs, complaining they couldn't move. Mothers chuckled, telling them that they'd eaten too much. "Oh, lie down and nap for a bit. It'll soon pass," they said, turning their backs on them, continuing to gossip about all those who weren't invited. A few minutes later, a chair fell over. The child sitting on it had started to convulse, foaming at the mouth. Some started to draw blood. Mothers cried in horror. An ambulance was called. Chaos ensued. In the end, the floor was covered in blood, puddles of saliva and limp bodies. The funerals were held the next day. 32 graves, side by side. Cries of, "God, why did you do this to me? What did I do to deserve this?" The newspaper headlines read, "Political rivalry, revenge by local caterers, God has forsaken us." Forensics explained that the food had been prepared with barbiturates, and the frosting contained high doses of rat poison. Death was unavoidable. Gregorio had not been invited to that party, Grandmother said. We were lucky. To this day, the souls of the children haunt the castle and will possess any child that gets too close. God have mercy on our souls. Well, my mother had had enough. Regardless of the fact that it was her hometown, she'd left at a young age to marry my father, moved away leaving behind the town and its folk tales. She walked into the living room and told my father to change the plane tickets. They'd be leaving the next day. Well, I panicked. I didn't want to leave. My summer ruined. I lay there staring at the ceiling, finally falling asleep. More dreams, more stories. The next morning, my grandmother stood on the porch, smiling and waving goodbye to me. She told me it was for the best. "You'll be back next year and everything will be fine," she said. "Oh, we'll see about that," my mother retorted, closing the cab door. After the plane took off, I looked down through the window. The clouds were eerily grey, shaped almost like a smile with crooked teeth. I pulled down the window shade, looked at the ceramic eye in my hand, closed my own, and said goodbye to the city that knows no peace. A rich city, but a city of misery. Back at her home, my grandmother was tidying up the guest room. She found the burst seed, and she crossed herself, and thanked God we'd left. It'd be 2 years before I returned. Part 3. 2 years had gone by. My parents thought it would be good for me to improve my Spanish by having me take the last month of class in town and stay until the end of the summer, and this time I would travel alone. I enjoyed the freedom, walking to and from school. It gave me a chance to look at the old buildings. Many of the roofs are caved in, doors chained with padlocks, but there was always the one that called to me. And one day I decided to go there. I had to see it. Don Quintero's house, the entrance now boarded up, just a few cracks wide enough to look inside of it. There was nothing left but the outer walls, empty space where windows and doors had been. I said a little prayer for him, about to say goodbye to the house, when I started to choke, gasping, trying desperately to breathe. Someone or something had a tight grip on my neck. I fell to my knees, grabbing onto the padlock to keep myself steady. Everything started to spin. It seemed like minutes went by, trying to grab hold of something and get back on my feet. Then, I felt my face being lifted upwards, and I saw him. The crooked smile, the decaying teeth. "You are back, and this time I will not let you go," he said. And he was gone in the blink of an eye. I picked myself up off the floor and turned to hear a neighbor yelling at me. "Leave now. The house is cursed. Go on, child. Go home and pray for your soul." My grandmother saw the shock in my eyes and shook her head. She knew that somehow I was different, very perceptive, feelings of empathy beyond healthy. Nothing could be done. Again, I was subject to the evil eye egg ritual. The yolk came out blood red, the 2 eyes, and now the clear part was grey. I was sent off to do my homework. Meanwhile, my grandmother went to her bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of her dresser, and pulled out a long, gilded box. Inside, laying in a nest of silk, was a rosary made of pearls, a gift from a family friend on her wedding day, blessed by the Pope himself. She prayed and prayed. I could hear the creak of the rocking chair and murmurs of the Lord's Prayer over and over again, well into the night. By the second week at school, I'd started to feel comfortable. My Spanish was good enough to communicate with my classmates, and being the tomboy I was, I befriended the boys in the class, wanting to tag along on their adventures. "Let's go to the second floor," exclaimed one of the boys. Everyone fell silent, looking at each other. Then they turned to me. One of them said, "I dare you to go to the haunted classroom. The classroom behind the stairs on the second floor. There's a hole in the wall. Blow through it and stay there to the count of 10. They looked at each other again. Of course, me wanting to fit in with the group, I said yes. The building was big, built in the early 1900s, made of grey stone, the first private school in town. The owners of several businesses wanted their children to live the Ivy League experience in preparation for continuing their studies abroad. High ceilings, wood interiors, paintings of war heroes, very tall windows covered with metal mesh for some reason. A fort-like appearance, elegant nonetheless. I stood there. I'd been told not to go upstairs, an area for the older children. When I started to climb the stairs, and halfway up I wrinkled my nose, the smell of burned flesh hit me. A horrible smell of copper, rot, and burned fat. I turned to walk down the steps, but the group of boys were waiting at the base of the staircase, looking at me defiantly. No, there was no turning back. I continued to the landing and turned left to go behind the staircase that continued up to the dormitories, now converted into a warehouse for old class materials and broken desks. As the door came into view, the smell grew stronger, but now the smell of copper was stronger still. More raw, more fresh. I walked up to the door and found the hole, blew into it, and regretting it for the rest of my life. The sounds of screams and wailing, children crying out, "Help me! Help me! Mother, please help me! Teacher, help us! Father, save me!" In the background you could hear laughter, a deep masculine laughter. The air around me grew hot, unbearably hot. I turned and ran back down the stairs, right past the group of boys who were looking at me like they'd seen a ghost. Out of the large church-like doors and straight to my grandmother's, bursting through the front door, running to her and resting my head on her lap. She caressed my hair, silent for a moment, and then asked what had happened. I told her, begging not to have to go back to the school. She half smiled and said she'd settle it with my mother. I heard their conversation over the phone. The same year the school was inaugurated. Every morning during the winter the furnace had been lit, a novelty at that time. Wood stoves were the norm in a household. The classroom started to warm up. In classroom 2E, the children arrived, removing their winter coats and dropping them on a desk, spilling onto the floor. Class began, and at some point the teacher felt sick, told the children to read their lesson, left the room, locking the door behind her. She was pregnant and nausea came over her. After emptying the contents of her stomach, she felt faint and walked to the principal's office, sat down waiting for the feeling to dissipate. Meanwhile, in the classroom, the children were getting restless. Without a teacher to control the group of 12-year-olds, they started to push the desks aside to make space for an impromptu game of cards on the floor, blocking the furnace pipe and the classroom door. The coats that had spilled to the floor fell close to the pipe and were pushed against it. They quickly started to smoulder, small tendrils of smoke rising. The children smelled something in the air, but thought it was from the furnace downstairs. In a matter of minutes, the materials burst into flames, catching the curtains and the wooden floor, which had just been cleaned with used oil by an absent-minded janitor. The thick stone walls of the building, and the fact that the classroom was behind the stone stairs, made the sounds from the classroom impossible to hear. It was the smell of smoke that alerted a teacher in a classroom next to the stairs, and that made him check. Horrified, he attempted to open the locked door, burning himself with the brass knob, and at that moment he knew he was too late. The volunteer firefighters wrapped the surviving children in wool blankets. To their horror, they saw how the skin peeled off the arms and legs. When moved from where they lay and placed on the gurneys, pools of blood started to form on the floor. In the end, none survived that day, and the classroom was locked down. Urban legend says that if you blow into the room, the air stirs the ghostly flames and revives the screams of the children. God have mercy on their souls. My grandmother finished, crossing herself. I didn't go back to the school, which allowed me time to do some urban exploring. The town had grown a bit by that time, a few more suburbs, but still had the air of a little town in the middle of nowhere. It rained every afternoon like clockwork, 1 hour of droplets falling on the hot earth, the smell of petrichor permeating the air. I started to believe it was God's way of washing away the sins of this cursed town. Wishful thinking. One afternoon, I was happily surprised to find a boy, not part of the original group of troublemakers, sitting on the porch. He'd come by to see how I was. He'd been worried that I wasn't in his class. Everyone knew each other in town, so it wasn't hard to find out where I lived. I told him about my experience, but he didn't seem surprised. He asked me to come over to his house the following afternoon to meet his brothers and sisters and play some board games. I told my grandmother, and she approved with a smile. She knew his family and was comfortable with the idea. The following afternoon I walked to his house and found myself surrounded by children. He had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. He was the oldest, the youngest being about 2 years old. His mother came out to greet me and smiled with a bright white ample smile. She was wearing a long dress made of colourful material, dangling earrings, leather sandals, and smelled of heaven, roses, and vanilla. I had a wonderful time. After the rain, we decided to go outside and play tag in the streets. Well, at moments I was confused. There always seemed to be an extra boy, dressed very strangely. Little Lord Fauntleroy comes to mind, but no one else seemed to notice, so I just ignored the fact and continued the game, avoiding him. Night set in, and his mother came out to tell me that she'd called my grandmother, and I was to stay for dinner, and she'd walk me home afterwards. The walk back was filled with her lively chatter. She was warm and cheerful. Well, I hadn't noticed that the street she'd taken brought us directly to the house. Yes, Don Quintero's house. As we walked by, I shuddered. She noticed. Worry set in her eyes. She gripped my hand and started to walk at a faster pace. My grandmother was waiting at the door, and I was shooed off to bed while they sat on the porch chairs and drank coffee. I was invited back to their home several times. Game time always left me cheerful and exhausted. Dinner, as always, was wonderful, and the walk back home was filled with laughter. Well, she never brought me back the same way, always avoiding his house. On the last visit before I left for my home, she handed me a parcel, wrapped in white tissue paper. It felt heavy. I thanked her and said goodbye. I showed it to my grandmother. We opened it. It was a small dagger made of polished obsidian. Grandmother smiled knowingly. She said it was to cut negative energy. She placed it in my suitcase and we went to bed. The following morning was a rush to get me to the airport. Everything went wrong. Keys missing. The car wouldn't start. I was destined to miss my plane. Again, grandmother saved the day by placing her rosary in my hands, and off we went. On the plane, I decided to close the shade on the window and not look back. I promised myself I would never return. Or so I thought. Part 4. My mother was weary of sending me back to my grandmother's, but it was my parents' anniversary and they were to take a month-long cruise. I argued that I was 18 now and could stay by myself at home. My father would have none of it. "Oh, you're safer with your family than on your own. It's decided," he said. I sighed, went back to my room and walked up to my dresser, opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a wooden music box. It had a hidden drawer within it. I tugged at it and finally saw my treasures: the ceramic eye pendant, the obsidian dagger, and the rosary. I closed my eyes, trying to shake off the shudder that ran up my spine. "Here we go again," I thought, picking up the rosary and pulling it over my head, wearing it like a necklace, remembering to hide it from my parents' inquisitive eyes. I'd been raised agnostic. Religion was not in our vocabulary. Well, this time around, Gregorio picked me up at the airport. Grandmother was getting old and was no longer driving. He dropped me off at her house and promised to come back that evening to go out on the town. Here I had the legal age to go to bars. I knocked, and after a few moments, she opened the door. My heart sank. She was bent over and moved slowly. Her hair had turned white and her eyes looked faded. Time has no mercy, and I'd just been confronted with mortality. She smiled at me, though, and invited me in. I took my suitcase to the guest room. Nothing had changed. The same bed, chair, dresser, and rocking chair in the corner. The same pink bed cover and satin pillows. I lay down and was reminded of how soft it was. I smiled and turned to the kitchen from where the aroma of fresh coffee and homemade cake came. We sat down for a couple of hours and chatted about the happenings in the last years. She was very satisfied that my life had been so active and worry-free. Night fell, and she excused herself. She was ready to sleep. I told her I was going out, and she handed me the key to the house. "Oh, don't forget to lock the door when you come back. And if you use any dishes, remember to wash them before you go to bed. Well, the souls will be restless if the kitchen isn't clean," she said. And this time it was me who rolled my eyes. Gregorio came by at 9 p.m. We were going to pick up the rest of the crew and then go to a new bar in town. "It's called El Calabozo del Dr. Creepen," he said. I was excited. My first time at a bar. We arrived, found a table, and started to talk to each other. So many years had gone by, so much to catch up on. After several drinks, we went to the dance floor, lights pulsating and the beat of the music. Well, I fell into ecstasy. As I was twirling around to the rhythm of the music, something caught my eye on the mezzanine. It was him, Don Quintero. I'd barely been a few hours in town and he had found me. I stiffened. Well, back home I'd done some investigation about empathy, and one article spoke out about how this trait sometimes disappears with age. I'd relied on this information, hoping it was true. I grabbed my rosary then, hung around my neck. In an instant, he was gone. I was walking back to our table. Someone grabbed my arm and I screamed, only to feel arms wrapping around me in a warm embrace. To my surprise, it was Pablo, the boy that had had me over to his house time and time again over that past summer. He'd gone from small and frail to tall, dark, and handsome. I felt myself blush. We talked a bit, exchanged numbers, and said goodbye. The night ended quickly, and we all went home. I remember going into the kitchen to check if there were dishes in the sink. Relieved to see no, I went to bed. The next morning was a rush. My family was coming to see me. Food was prepared, and more than enough, as it is customary here. My family slowly started to arrive. I'd forgotten how wonderful it was to be surrounded by so many people. Family. I'm an only child, so this was uncommon. My grandmother sat in her rocking chair looking over all of us, smiling. Life had come back to her eyes. She wasn't aware of my encounter the night before, and I never told her. Evening came and the family said goodbye. My cousin Mary asked me to go downtown with her the following afternoon. I accepted. Downtown was so different here. Back home malls, strip malls, and pristine white shops were the norm. But here it was filled with old buildings, colonial style, thick adobe walls and pink travertine facades. 80-year-old shops selling the same type of wares time and time again. churches everywhere. Well, tradition dictated that during Easter week one must visit 7 churches. Some drove, others walked, and still others, who carried some unknown penance, moved between churches on their knees. Sidewalks would end up soaked in blood that streamed down into the drains, a sort of sacrifice, replicating the actions of the first indigenous people. This land was bloodthirsty. We continued our walk until we came across an old theatre, 3 stories high, the first floor now converted into a museum. The theatre had been built by a foreign man early in the 19th century, and he'd been eager to bring plays and movies to this dusty, dry old town. Prosperity came with the construction of the building. New products and materials were brought in. People now started to learn about the outside world, and greed set into their hearts. As you can imagine, by now every weekend the theatre was full. People in their finery, drinks, music, applause filling the building at the end of each play, until one fateful night. An invitation to a cocktail party to be held on the 3rd floor. The sheer amount of people and the use of all the outlets for the extra lamps needed shorted the electrical circuits. Sparks flew, catching on the guests' clothes, who, in a drunken panic, ran around screaming, enveloped in flames, tripping and falling on the wood floor, which also caught on fire and eventually collapsed onto the 2nd floor. The workers and some of the surrounding shop owners tried to help, but were crushed between the 2 floors. Renovations were postponed several years, and only the 1st floor had been renovated and secured, now used as a cultural centre. Mary and I shared a spirit of adventure, and when she proposed we try to climb up to what was left of the upper floors, I immediately accepted. There was a little metallic spiral staircase left behind, covered in rust but stable enough for a couple of girls to climb up. So up we went, and as we walked onto what was left of the outer structure, I inhaled sharply. There were still pieces of the wood floor stuck to the sides of the walls, covered in what looked like melted plastic. Mary pointed out that it was the material from the people's clothes. I shuddered at the thought of skin that had burned into it. And then I heard his voice, ever so low and desperate. "Go, now," he bellowed at me. I jumped, startled by a creaking sound, and grabbed Mary by the neck of her blouse, pulling her with me towards the stairs. We rushed down, and as I stepped forward from the last step, the staircase crumbled to the floor. We walked out of the museum quickly, with our heads down, hoping we weren't caught. Mary didn't even bother to ask me what had happened. We were both just grateful that we were unharmed. That night I received a call from Pablo inviting me to dinner. He picked me up, and as we drove to the restaurant, I was surprised at how much the town had grown. It was no longer a town. It was a city. New businesses everywhere. Fancy suburbs, industrial warehouses and plants had now covered what had once been kilometers of farming land. It was a 21st century city. Over dinner, Pablo told me that, with the quick growth the city had experienced, some people wanted to hold on to the history of this place. Older people were being interviewed. An archive had been set up, and since he was a student and an amateur photographer, the committee had invited him to participate. Of course, he had his camera with him and started to show me some of his photos. And he started to slide through a series of photographs belonging to the graves of the people who died in the 1972 train wreck. 1,800 people had perished. As most were unrecognizable, they were buried in individual graves using different body parts from different people to form one person. But that's a story for another time. He continued through them, and one caught my attention. I asked him to go back to it. My heart started pounding. It was a gravestone. On top of it stood a small statue of a child, dressed like little Lord Fauntleroy. The same child that had played with us at his house that summer. The story was that he was the son of a well-to-do couple, their only child, taken from them by tuberculosis. His mother never recovered and was sent to an insane asylum. I told him then about seeing the child at his home and about Don Quintero. He sat in silence. I thought he figured I was mad and prepared myself to go home. He still said nothing. We talked about other things, our plans, our dreams, what we expected of the future, and the night came to an end. Well, Pablo had asked me to go with him on his assignments. I learned so much about this place, fascinating and horrifying. During my stay, I decided to study architecture back home. The fascination for the old intricate buildings was now deeply set in my mind. And yes, he followed me day and night. I was used to his presence now. He never spoke to me after the day at the museum. Only his eyes were now pleading, beckoning me to stay. But I was ready to leave this city. A rich city, a city of misery, a city that knows no peace. Part 5. 4 years later, I returned to do my thesis in colonial architecture. I was so happy to see my grandmother and my family. The reunion was repeated as in past years, except this time my cousins and I were sitting at the table talking about our lives, our children and careers, and my grandmother sat in her rocking chair, happy to see us all together as adults. Pablo and I had kept in touch. He'd studied arts, specializing in photography, now an employee for the city archive. I promised to see him the next day. He told me he had some exciting news for me. My grandmother started to doze off, so we decided it was time to say our goodbyes. I woke her and walked her to bed, returned to the kitchen and left everything clean. I didn't want the souls to be restless. Pablo and I met over dinner. His exciting news was that an intern was needed for renovations on the downtown historical buildings, and he'd put in a good word for me. Well, I couldn't have been happier. I was off to a good start. As we were getting up to leave, I saw him, Don Quintero, standing in the corner of the restaurant. This time his eyes were blazing. I heard him clear as day. Don Quintero is here. Don Quintero has to leave. I grabbed my sweater and hurried Pablo out of the restaurant, sat on the hood of his car and placed my head between my knees. "What's wrong?" he asked. I reminded him of my first encounter with Don Quintero. He couldn't believe this was still going on. He'd speak to his mother. If I was in any danger, he'd let me know. That night I called my parents with the good news, asking them to send the rest of my things. I started my new job visiting sites, picking up samples of frames, doors, and ironwork. After a quick lunch, I'd go to my grandmother's, which is now my permanent residence, and I worked on my thesis. Life was good, I guess. Decent salary, interesting job. I bought a truck, lived well, but there was always something missing. My happiness was never complete. Regardless, my job offered a good distraction, visiting the ruins of colonial homes, planning how we were going to rebuild them, what facades were going to look like. My mind was always busy, and the seasons came and went. I fell into a routine until the day my grandmother fell ill. Around midnight I heard a thud, jumped out of bed and rushed to her side. I found her on the floor, wide-eyed and gasping for air. I called an ambulance, turned to her to tell her. Her eyes widened as she whispered, "He is here." At the hospital, the doctors told me she'd almost had a heart attack, but aside from that, she was perfectly healthy for her age. It was time to speak to Pablo's mother. 3 days later, I was in Pablo's home, sitting in the dining room with his mother. She told me that the existence of Don Quintero was well known among the older population. The younger ones thought it was just an urban legend, but I was not his first victim. She said that he had attached himself to me because I was innocent. He needed that. Someone scared enough to do his will and to set him free. "You have 2 options," she said. "Continue to ignore him or do his will. If you do his will, you'll be subject to the curse of wealth and misery." I was speechless. I could feel fear climbing up my spine. "As long as you carry your grandmother's rosary, he cannot harm you directly," she said. "Be aware, though, he will torment you into doing his will. Find strength in yourself, and you'll be fine," she finished. She smiled a watery smile, blessed me and said, May God have mercy on your soul." The following year was an inferno. His tactics grew more and more aggressive. First he appeared at the sites I visited, but now accompanied by other spectres. I'd find myself surrounded by several of them. They would outstretch their hands towards me and mouth words I couldn't understand. And people were weary of being near me. "You have an air about you," they said, shuddering. My grandmother, ever so perceptive, prayed and prayed for me until one day, I'm sure it was from exhaustion, she died in her sleep. The family fought over her belongings in the house, so I was out on the street. Well, I quickly found a hotel to spend the night in, which turned into a week. In the end, Pablo offered me the spare room in his house, and I gratefully accepted. This accommodation did not seem to suit Don Quintero, and proceeded to torment Pablo as well. Then the vision started. Every person I saw on the street had a shadow on their back. Literally, they were carrying the shadow. Upon a closer look, the shadows were spectres of those who had left the realm of the living, and the spectres carried sacks of money. The bigger the sack, the lower the person that carried them was bent over. I started to pay attention to what was happening in the city. More industries were settling in, more and better paid jobs were available. People were falling into patterns. Get up, work long hours, go home, eat, watch television, sleep, and repeat. The weekends were dedicated to shopping and drinking. It was a sickening cycle. And then a streak of suicides began. Every day a person would throw themselves from a pedestrian bridge that was built above one of the main highways. The newspaper headlines telling the same stories. Debt, heartbreak, infidelity, depression. What had happened to this place? The curse was now at full force. More money, more misery, and with this, no peace. I no longer have the strength to talk about everything that's happened, except to say that it got worse. One day the receptionist at the archive told me that the following Saturday morning she was going to Temazcal, a steam bath guided by a shaman, a detox, she said. I could never figure this out. Such a religious city and still following indigenous rituals. Well, I accepted. I needed to get away. That Friday I arrived a bit early, and I found myself standing in front of a very large skin tent. At the door stood a very old man. He looked at me from head to toe and invited me in. As I entered, I heard him say, "You are not welcome. Leave now." I turned to see him fanning the air with an eagle wing tied with colourful ribbons. He then closed the tent door behind me. Others started to arrive, and the ritual began. There were 7 parts to the ritual. Each began with the pouring of water over different herbs placed on red-hot lava stones. Steam rose, filling the tent. The shaman chanted each time. As the 7th ritual began, I started to hear drums, rhythmical beats. I felt my heart beating in unison, and then I started to dream. Indigenous men and women, tribal fights, the Spanish invasion, time and time again, blood sacrifices, intentional or not. The curse had just been another tear on the eternally bloodthirsty land. At one point a towering man stood over me, skin as dark as the earth. He pointed, and somehow I knew he was pointing north. I awoke on the cool grass. Others were also there in deep sleep. The ritual had ended. I thanked the shaman, and he nodded knowingly. That night I told Pablo that I was going to go to Don Quintero's house. He decided to accompany me. He had no idea what I had planned. I knew there was nothing left of the house, nothing that would even hint where the last chest was buried. We got out of the truck, and I pulled a shovel from the back of the seat. Pablo stared at me, shaking his head. "No," he said. "You cannot. The curse. What will become of you?" I said nothing and walked to the middle of the property. He followed me, trying to take the shovel from me, but I stood my ground. I looked for some kind of sign as to where to start digging. The property was flat. Nothing had been left of the house. Even the floor tiles were gone. But there he stood, in the middle of the property, pointing to the floor. I glared at him. I took the shovel and started to dig. Pablo and I took turns until he hit something hard. It was the chest. I started to dig around it until we could see it completely. We pulled it out, and I started to cry. What would happen now? I thought of the sisters and their demise. Pablo started to push the chest to climb out of the hole, and I started to drag it aside. I couldn't see very well. My tears and the dust had created a film over my eyes, blinding me. But I just pulled, and suddenly I felt the ground shake and heard a loud crack. I rubbed my eyes, and all I could see were clouds of dust. As it started to settle, I gasped. Where the house had stood was a sinkhole, a bottomless sinkhole. I heard sirens. The police had arrived. Neighbors stood at their doors in nightclothes. Questions with vague answers. I was helped into my truck. Someone called out for help to get my equipment into my truck. Pablo. Where was Pablo? The next day, the newspaper headlines read, "Tragic accident at renovation site. 1 survivor and 1 life lost. Government has decided to temporarily stop downtown renovations. No further investigation necessary. An act of God. Mother Nature was to blame." I stood on the pedestrian bridge, looking down at the rows of cars rushing by to work, to school, to shopping, or whatever the people of this city considered important. How ignorant. How blind they are to reality. Priorities askew. I extended my hand over the rail and dropped the ceramic eye, following it to the ground where it smashed to pieces. In my other hand, I held the documents to my new properties, home and business up north. I then pulled from my pocket the keys to my new BMW. I looked up to the sky and called out, "Goodbye, Don Quintero. May God have mercy on your soul." I got into my car and started to drive north towards the city limit. Once I reached it, I pulled the car over, opened the glove compartment, pulled out a parcel, covered in now yellow paper. I took the obsidian knife and drove it into the ground. I got back into my car, leaving everything behind. A rich city, a city of misery, a city that would know no peace. So just going to take this opportunity to give a big shout out to all of you who've been coming by all these years. Now, in the next week or two, I am going to be celebrating 5 years of doing this. 5 years, can you believe it? I can't, I tell you. Don't know where that time has gone. And when I began, it really was just a hobby. Just something to keep my mind off everyday life, to be honest with you. I was working full-time, doing a master's degree in my profession. I was writing a blog about my profession. I was doing conference talks about my profession. And life kind of sucked, to be honest with you. And I thought, well, I have to do something away from my day job. And it turned out being this. And, well, a few of you liked it, and a few of you more liked it. And almost 250,000 of you have subscribed now. So I must be doing something right. So, yeah, thanks for keeping me motivated. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to, well, basically move away from a career that was becoming less and less rewarding for me, so I can now do this full time. Amazing, really. I've been able to move to a different country. I'm supporting my family doing this, so no complaints. Keep on listening, yeah? And of course, I've now recently branched out into podcasting, and basically still going to be free. Wherever I am, whatever I do, I'm not going to charge you for what I'm doing. I just love doing it, and I'm able to make a living as well, so everything's good. Alright, that's it. I'll be back again very soon, and I hope you can join me. If not tomorrow, then on Friday. Well, yeah, there's a podcast coming out tomorrow, so get over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to stuff like that, because you'll find me there now as well. Here again on Friday. Till then, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye.